In other words, we're born with all the same genetic material. Our cells are basically, like, I like the word that you use, benign. Like, that's where this nature versus nurture comes in. But at some point, our bodies are a blank canvas. And when we're exposed to something that we have no prior knowledge of, or how to even process it or identify or even just manage it, it affects us. It shifts the way we move forward from that point.
I'm Casey Main, author, writer, and party girl turned spiritual junkie, and I'm dedicated to helping you better understand the most important and most complicated relationship you'll ever be in, the one you have with yourself. It's the only relationship that you're in for the entirety of your time here, and it affects every single aspect of your life. Yet it is the one most often overlooked. This podcast is here to help you explore that relationship, get to know yourself so you can accept yourself, heal yourself, and become a better version of yourself. So let's get to it. Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Better You podcast, where we focus on better understanding our relationship with ourselves, because I believe that is the most important and most complicated relationship we will ever be in. It's the only one we are in for our entire lives from start to finish, and it affects every single aspect of life. So that is what this show is all about. I am your host, Casey Main. As always, I want to thank you for being here. Whether you're new, you've been following along for a while, from the beginning, just started, doesn't matter. Just thank you so much. This is the third episode in our Best of series, and which makes it, this is like confusing the way I've said this, but this makes it the second most popular episode of the podcast so far. So it has the second most unique downloads. That's kind of the measurement I went with. And I'm really happy this one made the top 4. It's so fun because this was originally the 7th show. So this aired back in September of 2019. So it'll be, if you guys listen a lot, it'll be just kind of funny to hear like baby me trying to podcast. And this was actually an in-person one. So Amy lives here in Jacksonville as well. So I was able to go to her office, and I remember it was on, I think it was on like a Saturday morning, and we like sat on her floor, and I was surrounded by all these papers and notes because I had like done all this research, and I'm not sure I even ended up using any of them because I quickly realized just how naturally curious I am, and that I kind of just think of questions as I go. But it's a great conversation, and I think it's a really important one to end the year on, because so much of what we've talked about so far is like different ways to deal with our issues. In this episode, we refer to them as traumas, and we talk a lot about how trauma doesn't necessarily have to be this like big event. There are little t traumas that happen in our childhood or earlier in life, and our perception of them is what makes them a big deal. And then it kind of sets up these insecurities and these like triggers we have as we go throughout life and relationships. And really that is what's affecting our relationship with ourselves, which is what's affecting our relationship with everybody else. And throughout the, I guess, year and a half now that the podcast has existed, we've had so many different conversations about how to look at those things, how to heal them, how to move past them, how to accept that they're there, how to move forward, how to make sense of them, all this stuff. And a lot of that dealt with kind of working through it in our mind. And I love this conversation because it just is this great reminder of our mind-body connection, and how sometimes our body can almost like prevent our mind from working through certain things that were, especially if they were like really traumatic. And so it's like we hold on to the energy and we kind of like suppress it because we think that's like safer. But then that stuff still shows up and affects our life. And so there's this really cool therapy process that we talk about in today's show called EMDR, which is a way to really access your like limbic system and let go of some of that energy and work through some of that stuff, like within your body, without necessarily having to like go back and relive it or talk about it like you do in like traditional talk therapy. So super cool episode way back in the beginning of the podcast. And I'm excited to re-air this one. So then next week will be our most downloaded episode of the podcast so far. I can't believe this one is the first one. I mean, I can believe it, but it's really cool. So make sure you are subscribed so you don't miss that. And then on the final Tuesday of the year, I will be airing a solo episode where I'll share like my kind of favorite takeaways from the year, the biggest life lessons I've learned, biggest realizations. I did that last year. There's an episode, it's 20 lessons for 2020, and I'm going to do it again. So this will be 21 lessons for 2021. So that will be how we end out the show. And then super excited for next year. Going to have a lot of amazing guests covering just a really great variety of topics. I've kind of come up with this like rhythm we're going to stick to in terms of all the different aspects of our relationship with ourselves, mind, body, spirit, soul, like whatever you want to call it. So we're going to have an equal mix of those types of topics as well as more solo episodes. I'm going to share more of myself and my thoughts. And then people who just have like really unique or interesting or inspiring stories. So going to be a great year. A couple previous episodes, if you really enjoy some of the things we talk about in this show, another really unique therapy modality we talk about in episode 81, equine therapy to bring you back to self with Dr. Ashley Dial. That's another way to heal things you've got going on without necessarily having to like talk through them if that's not your thing, which I totally understand. Instead, you can work with horses. And then we talk a lot about just the power of nature in our healing process. And so that's episode 79, Finding Forgiveness and Healing with Sarah Schulting-Krantz. And then back in episode 69, we talk about breath work, breathing through stress and anxiety with Dr. Emma Seppala. So those are all other episodes that discuss just kind of different or unique ways to heal whatever it is you've got going on, or just work on yourself, work through what you've been through, but maybe not necessarily sitting down and talking to someone else about it. Okay, so let's learn more about today's guest. Amy Pope-Latham is a licensed clinical social worker with extensive experience in treating children, adolescents, adults, and families. She received her undergraduate degree in psychology from Stony Brook University and a master's degree in social work from Stony Brook University's School of Medicine and Social Welfare. She offers EMDR as well as trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy and largely incorporates evidence-based practices and somatic and mindfulness-based therapy for a variety of presenting symptoms such as grief, anxiety, complex trauma, obsessive and compulsive thinking patterns, and substance use. And in this episode, we discuss how our minds, like our bodies, are actually set up to heal themselves, the different approaches to help reconnect our mind and our body and remove the continuous pain from trauma, how EMDR is a tool to access our limbic system, where we store and essentially hide our physical feelings and revisit and process traumatic experiences in a safe space, our drive for connection and how that impacts how we react to trauma, and how important it is to recognize that we are all in process, and wherever you are in that process is exactly where you need to be, which I think is just such an important message all the time, but I think especially as we close out this year and look to a new one. So that is it for the intro. We're going to go ahead and jump into this conversation with Amy. Okay, so we'll just kind of hop right in. Let's start with, if you can kind of just give a little bit of kind of who you are and a little bit of your kind of background and experience and like your current practice.
Okay, so hi there. My name is Amy Pope-Latham. I'm a licensed clinical social worker. I'm originally from the great state of New York and recently located to Jacksonville, Ponte Vedra Beach in the last year, and which is where I started my practice. It was really awesome to move. Previously, we were in Tallahassee for 2 years and working with kids, adults in substance abuse, trauma, athletes in the collegiate level, professional elite athletes, working a lot with grief, anxiety, particularly trauma. And I love what I do now. I get to work with a variety of people, children, bigger kids, my even bigger kids who we call our adults. And it's so fascinating from a preventative standpoint when I'm working with kids, because they're the future, or just even allowing, individuals in their mid-30s, 40s to recognize that, yes, they may have gotten to this point where they've struggled, they felt stuck, but they have so much more life to live, and giving them an outlet to do so where their life becomes more vivid and colorful. It's been such an awesome experience. So yeah, I'm happy to be here.
Yes, yeah. No, I love that. And you said one of the key words that I really kind of want to start with, which is trauma, because I feel like prior to probably the past couple years, I would think of that word in terms of just very extreme events. And only recently, as I started to kind of get a little bit more into self-reflection and personal development and started to listen to a lot more stuff and read a lot more stuff, I'm like, oh, okay. We all have some kind of childhood, or I don't know, maybe even an adolescent and adult trauma experiences that then kind of mess with our psyche and essentially are maybe the stem of a lot of our issues that we struggle with as adults. And that word trauma doesn't necessarily mean, abuse or neglect or anything extreme. It can be something that's seemingly very benign.
Right.
So let's start with trauma. What is it? And then what are all the different, I guess, kind of forms that it can take?
Trauma, essentially, the way I look at it, is any type of event that elicits a physiological response. In other words, we're born with all the same genetic material. Our cells are basically, I like the word that you use, benign. That's where this nature versus nurture comes in. But at some point, our bodies are a blank canvas. And when we're exposed to something that we have no prior knowledge of, or how to even process it or identify or even just manage it, it affects us. It shifts the way we move forward from that point. So yes, trauma can be what we classify, and I don't necessarily like to call it big T, little t. You'll see that quite often on different resources. I know it's a very popular way to describe trauma, but I tend to go outside of that paradigm only because trauma is anything, again, that can cause a physiological shift in the way you respond to something. And that's where a lot of, even in therapy and social work and as my program, and even other mental health programs, a main word that we get taught very early on is transference. And it's just how when we have a previous experience, something about that can inform our further experience, our future experiences. So trauma can be also what didn't happen, what we didn't experience.
Okay.
So largely what I work with in terms of when I introduce trauma, I started to recognize that when I'm looking at this field within the field of mental health, I try to look at the person as the whole person. So being trauma focused, a lot of times I notice people just because they are trauma informed doesn't mean they're trauma competent. So that way, that's how I essentially got into this. Well, trauma could be what didn't happen. If I'm searching for the worst, what could have caused the slightest shift? And that could be when someone was crying, or someone had a significant, a terrible grade on an exam. What stopped them from going home and telling mom and dad? Or what was missing for them to feel like they could feel safe to tell someone?
Okay, so all right, that's very interesting. So I immediately have two questions.
Yeah.
First one is, how early or how young can those traumas start to happen? And then I like how you put it that it's kind of this event we've never or something we've never experienced before. So I'm wondering, is that kind of the root of our fear of the unknown, or our issue with the unknown, which I feel like then kind of happens throughout our entire life?
I would say, to answer that almost immediately, your and mine, our fear responses, it still stems from our primitive, genetic backgrounds of being way back when we lived in caves. I mean, without fear as a hesitance, it's a safety mechanism. So if we weren't learning to be hesitant back in the day when we were living in caves and dwelling in little tribes, that could have meant the difference between surviving and being someone's lunch.
Okay, yes. I've heard that kind of comparison before, and now it's almost like we've evolved to where we're physically not in that amount of danger, but I guess maybe mentally we haven't evolved as quickly, so we kind of transfer that fear of being eaten by a dinosaur or a saber-toothed tiger to like public speaking and stuff like that's more this day and age.
Correct.
Okay.
Because that same system, your automatic nervous system, your central, it's this fight or flight. Whatever your body senses, we still have to remember that we're very primitive. In psychology, we'll call it your lizard brain. That's something that we essentially do not have control over. Almost like with your vagus nerve here in your dorsal ventral, your body is saying, okay, I'm detecting something. However, being in the 21st century, we have way more stimuli now and much more complex mechanisms to keep us safe. But we're still immune. We're not immune to mortality. So that's almost becomes our filter between fight, flight, and then freeze. But at the same time, you mentioned how early does this begin? It's hard to really answer that, mostly because, I've had people come in, and this has been so cool. This is what really made me appreciate the work I'm doing even more, is that I've had someone come in, and we were doing EMDR, which is, eye movement, desensitization, reprocessing. It's therapy, and it was a birth trauma. However, right? How do we like vocalize or verbalize or say anything that if a memory was nonverbal? We're at a stage in our life where we didn't speak. We didn't know what language was. Yeah.
So did that person like remember that? Because don't we technically store every second of every moment in our brain? It's just a matter of what we can recall.
Well, I will agree, and I'll add to that. The body remembers what our mind tries to forget.
Ooh, okay.
Yes. So and the thing is that we're thinking about, if we're nonverbal at a stage where language is not part of our development, we have no idea. That individual's trauma per se was a birth trauma where they started to notice a suffocation, and they said, I felt like there's something around my neck, and I feel like it's a cord. And this is going back. We go for the touchstone, which is the earliest memory in EMDR. So this is going back even earlier than 2 or 3 years old, and I feel like I'm being pushed.
Ooh, yeah.
Like there's like a shift, and I'm noticing like for those who are hearing this right now, my shoulder, they're kind of going up and down like a lean with a rock with it, going up and down, and kind of contorting their body, feeling the suffocation. And as it turns out, when they came back and were reflecting on this, they had told me when they asked their parents, there was the cord around their neck. I was like, oh my, poof.
Wow. Okay. So that's really big. Yeah. And so really then that begs the question, do we all have some level of trauma from our birthing experience? Because we're all either pushed out or kind of grabbed out suddenly from this safe, super comfortable environment to this bright, feels different, noisy world. So could we all have trauma from being born?
In some ways, yes. Think about even in trauma to a woman, a female's body.
Yeah.
A major surgery from a C-section, the tearing. I don't have children, but I've had women come in postpartum and say they're still hurting, and they have significant tears, like degrees down to their backsides, and that in itself. Even a loss is a trauma. So the loss of that identity as a pregnant individual, or just a single person, or a young married millennial, childless millennial, right? So there's loss across the spectrum, and you think about it this way, all I'm inviting us to do essentially is to think about how we try to categorize and stigmatize trauma. We've all experienced it, and I think just to kind of segregate and say trauma, we've all had it. So I don't know, I'm concerned in a way, but also happy that we're putting it on a pedestal. But at the same time, I think the more we focus on the bigger, harsher, okay, we have to look for the obvious, we're still getting caught up in things that perhaps we haven't really even addressed within ourselves.
Okay. All right. I kind of see that point. Yeah. So, because I think like in some way it's like you want to get to the root trauma as a way to maybe heal it or accept it. But you're kind of pointing out that maybe that's almost like feeding it more, in which case we need to just kind of view trauma as almost like accept trauma as a part of life.
Yes and no. Right, I agree. I hear what you're saying. It's almost as if we're just able to say, okay, well, this is what's happened to us, but it's shifting the lens from saying, oh, we're a victim, to really embracing our resiliency.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
Okay, I like that. So how do you go about like helping, or how does somebody make that shift?
Awareness. And one thing when people come in, it's like, can you help me with this? And I'm like, well, yes, but no, because at the same time, I'm not here, not qualified, licensed, or even trained to do a lobotomy, so I can't change who you are. This is not an operation room. This is a therapy room. In other words, everyone in this world, we all have whatever we need in this exact moment to heal.
I love that. I feel like I've said that a bunch of times, and I'm not. I don't know. I just strongly believe that. I haven't really been taught that, but okay, I love that.
That's fantastic, because it's true. When we think about when we get a cut or we break our leg, we'll nurse it. We'll put a cast on it. We'll put a bandage on it. Why? Because we're just trying to get out of our own way of healing. If we were to expose it, or still have like a limb that's exposed, we could re-injure it and then hurt it even more, and that could obviously jeopardize our ability to participate in the world.
Okay, that is a good point, that our bodies are set up, like we do heal ourselves physically.
Your body wants to heal.
So I imagine then our mind or our brain or our psyche or spirit, whatever you want to call it, does also. So all right, let's get into like a little bit of the science part of it. Like what does a trauma do to your brain?
Oh, it's fun. Just kidding. It's not fun. It's not fun. It changes. There are molecular changes in your brain. It's basically when we're learning something, think about when we're exercising, we're tearing the muscle fibers in our limbs, because that's how we inspire growth. Same thing with our brain. When we're learning, we're creating more synapses, more basically in boxes, folders, if you want to call it that, different ways to categorize things. So it happens when we experience trauma, we're activating different parts of our brain, but the more primitive parts, you have your limbic system. Dan Siegel, he's done this really fun way to illustrate this, especially to children and teens. It's, he uses his little forearm, my little forearm, and he says, okay, well, your forearm represents your spine, right? And then when you cover your thumb with your other fingers, your thumb represents, this is your emotion center, your limbic system, your hypothalamus, amygdala, all those, basically the sorority group, fraternity group of emotions, fight or fight, fear responses. This is where this is kept private, because your frontal cortex is the main processing hub that when we first get information, it filters it out. So just considering when something happens, we see it, but this is why it may take a minute or so for it to really wash over us like a tsunami. Think about the impact of a shocking event. Earlier, when we were talking about September 11th, watching, a tower, and then seeing a tower get hit by another plane. People are just like, what's happening? If you ever see videos, people are walking around Manhattan saying, what's going on? Like, kind of like, what's happening? Right,
because it was almost like so unexpected that it takes a minute to
process.
Like, see it and process it.
Yes.
Okay.
And so only then, after a little bit, when we were able to pick up that, wait a second, something's not safe, then your body's like, okay, well, I need to do something right now to either make myself survive this, freeze from it, or run from it. Fight it, flight it, or just stay very still. And so that's why your body automatically shifts, but not so much. It's an intentional but non-intentional process. So that's what happens when your brain first experiences something, your body experiences it. It's like, wait a second. What is this? Where does this feel familiar from? Have I ever seen anything like this before? Your hippocampus gets involved. And it's like, well, how can I ascribe this to something? This must be familiar. No. Okay. And I guess we're going to have a moment we're going to have to learn. So that's why you see almost a delayed response. I think about when, if there's ever been a moment in your life you were informed that someone had passed away, it may take a minute or so, or even a couple hours, for the magnitude of that loss to settle in.
Yeah, I've definitely experienced that. And then almost, I don't know, I feel good hearing that, because I've almost been like, what's wrong with me that I'm not like processing this immediately? But that makes like a lot more sense. And so that whole process of kind of taking something in and then kind of asking, all right, have I experienced this before? Is that where kind of, because I've heard before that we tend to analyze the present and even, I guess, like worry or think about the future in terms of like a historical context of what we've been through. And that's like our brain trying to like find all the patterns.
Correct.
Which then kind of ties into how we maybe like reinforce our own patterns.
Correct. That's why I say we will tend to default to what we know.
Okay.
When we're given a situation. There's a questionnaire in terms of my training and certification with EMDR. The Personal Transformation Institute, her name is Deborah Kennard. What I found so interesting, I was just encapsulated by it, was when she mentioned this answer. I'll show you here. It's a series of questions that we want to figure out what you do really well. Because what you do really well also keeps you stuck. So these questions here, one of them, if you've noticed, it says, in an emergency situation, what would you do? And it's so fun. I say it's fun because every person, including ourselves, because in order to be trained and certified, we have to go through it ourselves. So it's fascinating in my experience helping my colleagues through this and doing it myself personally. Every time when you're asked those questions, you sit back, you take a moment, and you're trying to piece the puzzle back together and say, well, what would I do in that situation? You have to think of how many emergency situations you probably survived, or perhaps being on an airplane. What would I do in an emergency on an airplane? Oh, okay, they tell me this to do on the flight attendants, or now, unfortunately, with the culture of mass shootings, you hear about how to respond to an event like that. So you're taking all these pieces of information, defaulting to what you know, which might feel more safe.
Okay,
yeah.
That makes sense. And so just so that everybody knows a little bit about what these questions are, they're kind of like, what are you most proud of? What is difficult for you to do? What do you do when you're under stress? How are you with deadlines? Do you cry easily? Do you cry in front of others? Is it easy for you to ask for help? So when we answer these, because these are some very self-reflective questions. And then I feel like if I were to try and answer them, there's almost like a couple different answers. There's like how I wish I was, or what I'm trying to be, and then the truth. So I guess that kind of goes back into like, how do we get in our own way versus like, how much do we want to be a certain way, but we're not being honest. And if we're not being honest, like, how do we actually address it? And then maybe that goes back to how we kind of like reinforce or like you said, what we're good at can keep us stuck.
And it's fun because, in this moment when we're doing this component, it's part of the history taking, because there's 8 phases in EMDR. So in a history taking, this is included, which is not something that other EMDR trainings do, but I love sharing resources with other providers in the community. If anyone had ever asked, it doesn't hurt to offer this, even if you had no idea of a concept of the answer. Because, she has used somatic interweaving into this type of EMDR therapy, and that's all that is. It's allowing you to go back and become comfortable with, because when you are getting close to pain in an EMDR session, when we're targeting a very painful emotion, whatever you do really well is going to come up.
Right.
And it's so cool. So we want to predict, and that way when it does show up and manifest, we're able to allow it to be here. And it's so fascinating when your body just feels that it's okay to feel safe, or whatever that means. Like for that person, for example, some folks love to go outside of themselves. So, for example, let's say we're processing a really traumatic event, a loss of a pet, which is serious trauma. Perhaps someone who's very limbic phobic, they're very afraid to access that limbic network. They would say, well, I'm noticing the clock getting really loud all of a sudden, or I'm noticing the trees. And as a facilitator in that example, I'd say, wow, just notice how quickly your body just came up and just did that for you to keep you safe.
Right.
Wow.
Rather than sit with what you're feeling, it's like, let me focus on something that's outside of me.
An appreciation of whatever it is that you've learned to keep you safe. It comes up even in a contained space like this, and we allow it to be there.
Okay. So, because that goes back to just our almost like built-in survival mechanisms.
Correct.
Okay. So let's take a moment and explain what is EMDR. So I'm a little bit familiar with it, but for those who aren't.
Oh, it's a therapy modality. Some people think, it's a treatment, I can go in and blah, blah. There is a protocol that when we have natural disasters, crises, immediate crises, it can be very effective. There's superheroes out there who do that, and I have so much respect. Tremendous admiration for the work that they do. They'll literally go to these places who have been depleted. Their resources have been depleted, hurricanes, tsunamis, earthquakes, and sitting with people who have experienced sudden loss. It's so incredible. I call them first responders because they truly are. And that's great. There's, as I said, Francine Shapiro, she passed away this year. She was the pioneer in founding this therapy. And essentially what had happened, I'll summarize how she came to. She was walking around and her eyes were going and she was thinking of something. And she noticed that by these eye movements, there was a shift. And the long and the short is that we're here now where it's become such a really phenomenal vehicle for change and healing for people, because you're allowing them to really go back to a memory, a painful experience, without re-traumatizing, and allowing them to heal from it. Because when we're stuck on something, in other words, our brain is trying to make sense of an idea, or we're trying to figure something out, or unfortunately in our culture, think about bereavement, we get 7 days to quantify someone's life. Mm-hmm. Our whole society is based on moving on, moving forward, moving fast. That doesn't mean our brains and bodies can do the same. Mm-hmm. So what EMDR does is allows it to process through and to find a place where you're no longer really attached to that intense experience, that it's really happening and it's still happening, but it just sits there. It's, in other words, it's part of you, but it's not you. In other words, you're not living in that skin. It's just part of your memory. There's not the intensity that it still might be happening, recurring in the background. I almost say it's like having, your iPhone when you swipe up all the apps, and there's that one that just won't. You just can't get it to close no matter what you do. That's how trauma, a loss, a grief, anything that you've experienced can sit.
Okay, so, but how does it, where does it tie in with the eye movement? Because I know it's eye movement, desensitization, and reprocessing. So we're desensitizing. In other words, we're taking the intensity out of it. So that's what people think, well, it's kind of like exposure therapy. Well, yes, in a very unique way, because we're targeting your limbic system. In exposure therapy, you're just gradually exposing until, you're taking the fear out of something. But in this situation, we're going back to a very deliberate moment in time. And what's so fascinating is what I love to do, and I've noticed my clients let up when this happens, particularly with more, I would say, very significant abuse. I say, you don't have to give me detail. As a matter of fact, I don't want to know the detail. You are welcome to share it with me. But if it means that will flood and feel that you are re-experiencing your trauma, I'm not here to harm. Mm-hmm. There's a big responsibility for nonviolence in this treatment, because you can go outside of what we call the window of tolerance. And that just means when we're in this moment of extreme flooding of emotion, we're just hit with all these different things going on at once, sadness, tightness in your chest, the lump in your throat, wanting to cry. If you get to a point where it's too much, meaning it's just too much at one time, you can dissociate. Yeah. Okay. So the eye. So this is where I'm going around it. So I'm going to go right back to the center of the core of this therapy, is that when someone comes in, we're going down the pathways of what came up at a certain time or what way they feel limited. And we go back to an earliest, if not the earliest time they remember feeling a similar way. And we do this by identifying this is all the history taking part. So part 1 is history. So we'll go in and say, well, what's some way you're feeling limited? Okay, what would that say about you? And that's what we call your negative cognition or negative belief. And by using that, we'll go back and say, okay, well, how's it shown up here? And we'll say, okay, well, what's an earlier time you remember feeling this way? Okay, and how about an earlier time? This is not a standard therapy model where, someone says, oh, this and that, and they'll want to give you more detail. I say, okay, I just want headlines. Mm-hmm. When you're limbic, the one thing that could take you out of it just as quickly as getting into it are your words. So the more you think about something and you can give more detail, you will allow yourself not to get into where you're really activated, is what we call. Okay, is that why this is considered, because I read while kind of doing some research before this interview that, there's kind of the talk therapy, which I guess is like top down, and then there's more this somatic therapy, which deals with body sensations, which is bottom up. Correct. So it's like, that's where your brain could come in and disrupt the bottom up movement.
Absolutely.
Okay, that makes sense. All right, so you take the history.
And when we find that touchstone, and it's very collaborative, because at some point it's really, this is where I always say, the client-patient is the consumer, I hate that word, but client-patient is the expert of him or herself, themselves. This is where it does require us to come in as the clinician and the expert and say, okay, well, it sounds like this is a good point, because if they can no longer recall, they might be able to, but you really don't want to force. You never want to force. Mm-hmm. So, okay, well, this might be a good memory to start. Okay, so I'm going to show here, I have what our pages look like. It's a fun script. It's a script. So see, this is an example of how we go down and we find the history, and we go down, and you go as far as you need. You just keep going. This template is just like you write down. I literally just list one by one by one by one headlines of what someone has been. But if you're listening, these boxes are so small that you really, as I said, you do not want detail. You just want the headlines. Trusting that when you hear the headline, when your body hears that headline, when you think of it, it knows what it's been through.
Yeah, so guys, this is literally saying like find the targets, getting to the root of the present issue, and then it has all these questions and where I guess the therapist would write like different triggers and earliest memories and then even like red flags. So that's so interesting because it's like a very organized, like practical way to go about identifying like what our triggers are, which is something we all talk about now. Like now I think we're all a little bit more aware of the fact that we have these triggers. But then I think the majority don't know, okay, what do I do with them?
And it's fascinating too, because, you know, when I say fascinating, I love science. I love objective data. For me, I mean, I love medicine. That was my heart and soul. I tend to have always been, well, if I find that it's not evidence-based or something I can read through science, data, report, research, I would be a little more shy. I know a lot of people have come in and initially been like, well, is this like the movie Men in Black when you hold up the flashlight and you just zap it and you wipe my memory? And I'm like, no, that'd be kind of cool though. But what I love about this at the same time is that template of taking down all those, you know, those examples, those memories, those moments, it also offers a client that I love to give at the end when they technically graduate, they can see how far they've come. They hold on to that. People are like, well, because it sounds kind of hokey. I'm like, no, I would love for you to see that we're measuring. We're taking down, we're listing very specific moments in time. And when you process through, matter of fact, there may be, I've had the most so far in the career here that I've had, it's been 6 pages of memories. Just boom, 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 boom. And I'm just listening. I never write in session, but what I do is when we're in EMDR, we're doing this specifically, I just list. And I tell clients very clearly, I'm like, yeah, what I'm going to be doing is as your scribe, as your personal assistant, I'm just taking down exactly what you're saying and we're writing it down, the best handwriting that I can, so that when you leave, you're seeing how much that you'll be able to pull through, but also probably how much you're only going to touch 3 or 4 of these, if maybe 5.
So, okay, so how, all right, so I get that. It's kind of like you go memory and try and get to like the earliest one. Because I'm sure there's a lot of people listening thinking, okay, I can't remember that far back, but I think it's more we don't spend the time to try and do that. So like, how do you, I guess, help people remember earlier than they think they can remember? Like, is it any kind of almost like a meditative type state, or it's just like, do they close their eyes? Is there anything to help get them more like relaxed, or like, what does that look like?
It's fun because it's almost like you're playing 2 steps forward, 2 steps back. In other words, you're trying to gently allow them to become activated within their limbic system. And that tends to come very easily where they're able to not necessarily remember, because sometimes you may not, and that's okay, because some memories are not verbal. Sometimes you're feeling them. But when you find the right negative cognition, negative belief, something about when your body hears it, it's like, oh, and you'll see the tears or something just shifts. I mean, part of what I love to do and why I think even when I've done this through teletherapy, I don't really enjoy teletherapy as much, because when we're in here, person to person, I become a very keen observer of who's sitting before me. And I notice there's a subtle shift. It's so fascinating. When you find it and it's right there, something within their system just, like they go, It's like they're, take a step back. Wow. And then you'll see maybe a slight shift in their cheek color. Or I've noticed this is a big thing. People hold their breath. So when I notice that they stop breathing as much, I know that they've hit something that was a little significant. We've hit a nerve. I want to stay with that. Yes, this is very activating when you're doing the history taking. And that's how, if you're able to allow the body to feel like, oh, there it is. If it's not the right, I don't like to say right, I like more of the call, makes sense, doesn't make sense. If it isn't necessarily the best negative cognition for them, you won't have those type of reactions. As a matter of fact, I've had people therapists come in from trainings saying, well, yeah, we did this and I feel like I have more to do. And then when we sit together, I recognize there's a big a theme, we all do this when we're first learning, that negative belief was actually tied to their memory. So it really wasn't, like, it was part of it. So it really wasn't a negative belief. As a matter of fact, it was something safe because it was connected as a protective mechanism to say, I guess that's activating, but it's not. In other words, this individual was a memory with that they were made to feel really insignificant or really ugly. And that was their initial negative belief. It's usually an I am statement. I'm insignificant. I'm ugly. And I said, well, based on what you're sharing with me as like the memory you targeted, I'm sure that's how you felt at the time. Maybe that's what you were made to, but is that really how you really felt in that moment? Because it sounded like I'm not safe. And I asked that person, I'm like, is it about you, safety, or is it about you? I'm insignificant, I'm ugly, or am I not safe? I'm unlovable. And when I asked to hold that there, I said, just hold this right here. Hold these two options. I'm not safe, safety, or something about me. Shift. A huge shift. Obviously, if it comes out, I'd love to try it on you. But it's fun because, again, I would say it's fun, but it's incredible that, just by noticing the shifts, you're seeing the body in action. When if we're distracted by thoughts and thinking, we're not going to have that much of an impact. Like, you see it, it's like a wave of emotion. People, they wear their heart on their sleeve, you can tell when they become emotional. That's the type of intensity that I'm describing.
Right.
It's so powerful.
Okay, so this is so interesting because I can't help but think of myself and that. And I think me, probably like a lot of other people, at some point in time must have become disassociated from a lot of my feelings from a physical standpoint. And that's one of the things that I kind of notice, and I've described myself a little bit as numb. And it's not that, you feel bad. It's that you don't really feel. And actually it was during my little hurricane party with my friends when we evacuated. My one friend, April, she's like, oh, you guys, I just got one of those bubble up moments of just pure happiness. Do you guys ever know those? And I just remember thinking, I was like, yeah, I've had that before. Not often though. And so I think we become, I don't know, I get what you're saying in terms of we're almost blocking our limbic system or holding all those emotions in. So you go through this history with somebody and you find maybe the root or the memory you want to deal with. Right. And so then what?
And then we go into phase 3, which is assessment. And that's where we take the specific target, which we call targets. And we'll go down and I invite people when they come in to either, if they're visualizing being on an airplane or watching on a movie. My younger folks, they'll say watch on YouTube, or you're watching a TikTok. You're even on a train in Europe, but you're just watching it go by. You're watching a scene go by, and you want to pause in that one moment. What's a specific image? And people will give you that image, and then you ask them to you say what's the negative belief, or if it's still I'm not safe, I'm unlovable. They'll give you words like shame, guilt, and that's okay. It's all part of, again, activation. And what's the biggest part here, and this is where it becomes a little more objective, is we asked to rate. Usually, I've noticed in our training, and even during part of consultation, which is a requirement for certification, I initially would do a positive cognition. And what I noticed is when I work with a lot of individuals with anxiety, or who are so good at staying up here and avoiding here. I see a lot with medical professionals, actually, and my athletes, too, because they have to compartmentalize it's incredible. It's like another talent. But in order to, and I've noticed that when I would ask their positive cognition, they would get out of their limbic system. So it takes them out of it. So when I remembered going through that, and I said, you know what, I'm going to keep that towards installation, which is when we want to find something that they want to put instead of a negative belief. We want to say, what do you want to feel about this moment instead? So I skipped this part. So you go negative cognition, technically positive, but I don't do that in this phase. Validity of cognition, it's how true to those words of the positive belief feel to you right now. The positive and what we call validity of cognition, the VOC, that I do again in installation, which is phase 5. So I go right to the SUD, which is how upsetting does it feel to you on a scale of 1 to 10? Or when you hear these words, where does it hit you? What number? Or oftentimes with people who have anxiety, and this has been so awesome. Again, I continuously have to shift my gears in the moment. It's like a once in a lifetime experience every time someone's in here, which is so cool. So if someone's very limbic phobic, like I've said, they would be more prone to say, well, a 5 or 4, like underrate it. So I say, okay, well, where do you feel that? And they'll go, well, in my chest maybe. Okay, well, if your chest, if that feeling in your chest could speak to you right now in this moment, what would it feel? Heavy, sad. Like you got. I'm like, okay, well, if those emotions, that part in that body, your throat, or let's say you feel it in your jaw, if it could rate that moment for you right now, what would it give? And that's when you tend to find the truer disturbance.
Right, because that's where you're taking more of that bottom-up approach versus top-down. Like, not what is your mind saying it is, but what is your actual, like, your body saying it is. Okay.
And that's usually where you'd find, that's where it's like that sweet spot. You ask very, and resourcing is a powerful thing prior to all of this, because when I have individuals come in who have no connection, I say your mind and your thoughts, the thoughts are the language of your mind. Your feelings are the language of your body. People have come in who have been very disconnected, and I invite them through resourcing to become like the United Nations ambassador to themselves. So once they learn that they can communicate between these two, but still stay safe for however they feel to be living, I'm not here to change someone, but when they need to reprocess something, I invite them to become familiar with this language of their body. It really does affect in a great capacity how much they're able to really process, because they're activating the worst part of what they feel. It's so fascinating.
Okay, so kind of going back to what we were talking about earlier, that we are set up to be able to like heal ourselves, is kind of the point of, I guess, getting to that earliest memory, or like almost like exposing that wound so it can heal itself?
Yes.
Okay, I love
because
that.
That earliest memory, that's why I say if that person had 6 pages, we probably only did 4 or 5, because they're linked. It affects the way perhaps we engage with our people in the world. It affects the way we engage with ourselves. Some people, when they're young kids, there's a fantastic quote. I apologize. I don't have the individual's name to give them credit, but it's not mine. Just put it out there. I read she had mentioned that when a child grows up feeling afraid for their parents' safety and worrying about loving their parents, they learn to not love themselves. So you have to consider, if they're learning that it's not safe to love themselves, they can only love their parents or be afraid or something's going to happen to them, that will greatly impact a large part of their life. Whether that be through social anxiety, introversion, fear, panic, perhaps codependency in relationships. We can go down the rabbit hole. But more or less, because of the earliest experience, there are more unlikely have been shifts in the way they've navigated their world since.
So, okay, I'm conceptualizing it in my mind, and it just really makes sense. So we have some kind of, we'll call it traumatic event, and not saying there's anything wrong with the word trauma.
Yes.
And then that almost kind of sets up how we view ourselves, like within the world, which then is going to snowball, like domino effect, everything else. Right. So then when we wind up in therapy, say in our mid-30s, like I am, it's like you've got to undo like all those, or try and get to the first domino, or whatever knocked over like the first domino to, okay. Do you find, like, is there a theme among most people? Like, I'm kind of starting to almost assume that it usually comes down to some version of what you just said, like not feeling like we're lovable or we're worthy or we're safe. Like, are there common themes among like our root?
Powerless, helpless, invisible. I've seen a majority, I would say, in the last 3 years, truly. I'm invisible. I don't matter. I'm not safe. And the invisibility is, it's incredible, because you have to consider in that moment, wherever they were, or a series of moments when they had to essentially just hold their breath to stay quiet, or just try not to get in trouble, to avoid whatever that might meant if they were themselves. Like, you think of us as children, You know, I can't get enough of children now. When they laugh, I say it's like I just want to bottle up and sell it because it's, you know, it's a pleasure. And you think about the curiosity that a child has. You know, they just have a beautiful disposition to look out in the world. But when that's hindered in some way, learning, and, you know, it affects people just so greatly that if they're not feeling that they have to, you know, be themselves, who can they be? So invisible, a chameleon, kind of blend in. But what they're doing essentially in the biggest picture of it all is they're just avoiding their emotions. They don't feel important. They don't feel like they matter.
So that's where we start to, you know, I don't know, almost like put on our masks or kind of change or morph who we are because we're seeking acceptance and connection. Okay.
You have to consider, right? Everything that we've done and we continue to do is so that we're not kicked out of the tribe.
Ooh.
Everything, including our own family systems. Can you imagine as a child, just sitting there at home, whether it be 4 or 5, I'm going to go 4 or 5 years old, and, you know, you do something that's so bad, and you learn that it's so bad because you get screamed at, or you witness mom and dad fighting, or just something happens where you're just like, okay, I'm in big trouble. We learn through our mistakes how to avoid doing those mistakes, so we avoid punishment. So we avoid getting, you know, having mom and dad cut off their chain supply of love towards us. And it's, again, it's really adaptive. That's why I say I look at what's strong in people rather than what's wrong. So anytime when you mention the words like, yeah, we have to go back on all these different moments and kind of, you know, all these different dominoes, that can feel really overpowering and overwhelming to someone coming in for therapy. Like, oh my gosh, I'm going to be here forever. And usually my MO, and someone comes in and says, no, as a matter of fact, I really don't want you in here forever. I'm going to be in here aging. It doesn't serve me or any good being in here aging with me. I want you to live your life. You know, and being that they have the freedom to do so. They have the liberty to do so. And that's why with memories being linked, even if it's like 6 pages, they're pretty much connected to this negative belief. But it all comes from adaptation. We want to figure out how we can stay connected. Think about social theories. Like if we're going to change... there's a beautiful, I always say beautiful because I'm so intrigued by social psychology, but there was back in the 50s or 60s, there was a study where this teacher, that I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, the brown-eyed, blue-eyes experiment.
I think maybe, but I can't remember what it was.
Yeah, it's so cool, where his teacher, she assigned one day these kids with the blue eyes. They would have all the recess, the extra time, this and that, and all the brown-eyed kids had to sit in the back of the class. They had no recess, and the kids were like, this is no fair. And the brown eyes and the blue eyes were like, this is fun. We're in control. We're in power. Very similar to the Stanford prison experiment. Because what happened was the next day, or I think the 2 days later, I don't know how long she allowed these kids to do this per se off the top of my head, but she switched it. When the blue-eyed children had the power, the access, those blue-eyed children were like, they were devastated. They were very upset that the power was taken from them. So I mean, like when we're given power, like we feel like we can connect, but it's a group. Realize she put them in groups. So they bonded. They didn't go ahead and say, here, I'm going to stay with the blue eye because she prohibited it. So what do? We adapt, so we stay within our group. Similarly, like when we're given a task to just make it in the world today, I mean, we're still going to find ways to find community and stay within the community. Our identity essentially depends on it. You think about it. I don't like that word, actually. It doesn't essentially depend on it, but our identity is really much solidified in many ways through how our our social networks are created and how we maintain them.
Yeah, I love that, kind of going back to you saying, like, we don't want to get kicked out of the tribe, because that is a very, probably like a basic instinct that's in all of us. And then I can't help but think, okay, so we want that connection.
Yes.
But like connection is just such a fitting word in this conversation because, we're kind of also talking about the connection between like our body and our mind. So it's like, if we're disconnected from ourselves, I imagine that then inhibits us to be able to connect to others.
In a very genuine way. Yes.
Okay. All right. So what does, going back to the EMDR, because I'm just kind of fascinated by this. So where does the eye movement play into it? Like what is, do our eyes start to flutter? Do they move around? Like, is that some kind of indicator to you, the therapist, like what's going on with us? Like, why is eye movement even in the name of it?
Well, it's how Francine, when you move your eyes back and forth, it's activating that limbic network. If you think about it, if you've ever seen like in a movie or like on a screen, if someone's pretending or showing that they're reading something, you'll notice their eyes are moving. Mm-hmm. It's like a typewriter. We're encoding information. Our eyes are just very developed, enhanced, unique, because we have different colored eyes, scanners. So that's how we process and we get think about all the billions of information that our brain is receiving right now in this moment through our eyes. So naturally, you think about, even right now as I'm talking, right, my eyes are moving because I'm going back into my memory trying to pull out my information. You know, there's been graphics I've seen on the internet of like how you can tell when someone's lying based on the way their eyes are moving. It's fascinating. So the eyes moving back and forth, it's just a way to activate the limbic network. And so what we're doing is after I say, well, how disturbing does that feel? And they get a higher, I would say about 6 or 7 is pretty standard. It's not concrete. It's not in stone. Sometimes even if it's a 5, we'll get there. You know, they're really good at hiding in the limbic. We'll get there. But generally speaking, then I ask them, you know, where are you noticing this in your body? As you can see that there in that script. And then I'd like you to focus or bring up that image where you're feeling in that body. And, you know, I ask them just to follow my fingers.
Okay, so you're leading the eye movement almost because like you said, it's a scanner to try and connect to that limbic system. Okay, I see.
But sometimes I've noticed this too, is that guilty of it myself in training. I would just follow along and I would be like, nope, not doing it. So what I invite people to do at certain times too, if I've noticed that they'll use this as a way to avoid activating limbic. So instead of feeling, they'll just start counting, which is it's a very cognitive, deliberate act.
Oh, because because if they're watching your fingers or your hand like move back and forth, but counting, that's how you like stay in your mind versus actually allow the eye movement to access the limbic system.
Correct.
Interesting.
Actually, matter of fact,
we're so tricky,
right? Like it's so much fun because actually one of my favorite techniques to even introduce to my teenagers, particularly when there's like panic or anxiety, I say give yourself a cognitive task. In other words, balance a book on your head. There's a big thing on Instagram now, on the gram, where you pose like a flamingo, like you put one of your legs up, balance on one leg, or look at a word search. My favorites, because what you're doing is, this is very, again, cognitive psychology. You're giving yourself a specific task to focus on, and by doing that, you are inhibiting. Your brain is not really good. We're not good at multitasking.
Right.
We're not.
Well, that's what, and I've had this conversation with a couple people recently. Like we actually can't do it. It's a lie. Like we're
suck at it.
Instead, we're just bouncing back and forth between a couple things.
That's what scares me nowadays. Like with people obviously texting on the road, because we're not. It doesn't matter how old we are and how much more developed our brains are. Because people are like, well, you know, brains aren't developed in 25. I'm like, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how old you are. Your brain, we're not good at multitasking. We try and we filter in so much at every moment. Like even just the colors in this room, the temperature. I mean, we're just doing so much that. If you're given an emotional task and a cognitive task, a very specific oriented task, chances are you're going to have to make a decision, one or the other. Right. And most likely cognitive is going to win.
Right.
Yeah.
Because it's safer.
Correct. And so by doing that, they avoid activation, which is fine. So what I do at that moment, besides giving my arm the workout, I don't mind it. I just practice with a shake weight at home. Yeah. But what I do is I'll say, well, do you feel comfortable? I always ask. It is so critical to ask. It's very, what's the word? Even though I am the clinical expert, I am never the expert of someone. So before I do anything, even let's say, because I sit in one chair and they sit in the other chair, there's a table in between the two of us. I will sit on that table. I always ask. I don't just go and sit. Even before we get to these EMDR processing, history taking, I will practice with them, letting them know what it looks like, model it. So we understand mutually what's a good place. So let's say when I sit there, if a client doesn't really feel comfortable, generally have not had that happen, knock on wood, but if it did, we would just do it a little bit further back or find an alternative. But so far, when I say, man, it's okay if I sit next to you at this point, they said, okay. And so when I hold up my arm then, I do what's called, well, let's kind of figure out where's the good spot. You want it to be, in terms of your fingers, you do like Girl Scout honor, like 2 fingers up. And you want it to be just a little uncomfortable. Like you want it to be close, but not to the point where like you're touching. Not where you're going to go cross-eyed, but just enough that you feel uncomfortable that someone else is in your space. Okay. I also have a fancy light that I use. There's a company called Neurotech, and they offer a light bar, which is like a tripod, and it's like goes back and forth. does it for you, or the pulsers. But I think just being very hands-on with that, like being with using my fingers, it allows me, again, to observe very carefully what's going on. Because you asked, can you see what happens? And the answer to that, the long and the short, is yes. Because if someone, let's say, when we practice going over speed, you want it to be fast, but not to the point where they're like this. Because then, again, they're going to get lost. They're not going to be feeling. They're going to be thinking, how the hell do I keep up?
Right. So I guess is the point of finding like that sweet spot of how close your hand is to them and how fast that they're not getting distracted in their head, or really even have that kind of room to go off into your thoughts and think about other stuff. Okay. That makes
often
sense.
too, and I've noticed that it still might be too much, meaning that it's just too much stimuli, I invite them to close their eyes. And as a matter of fact, that's just as powerful. Just as powerful. And I asked, and sometimes when this works, but then something becomes too emotional and they become flooded and they start to cry, I invite them, would you feel better if I would go to tapping? Would you feel more comfortable if I would go to tapping? And they'd give me permission. And what that means is using a pen. I don't physically touch clients, so I use a pen, and I would gently tap. We go over this beforehand, either on their hands, on their knees, because these chairs recline. So I say, okay, is it okay on your knees? And so when they do consent and they would like me to go tapping, there's no, hey, does this feel okay? Were you going to feel comfortable with that? Again, taking them out of that moment.
Right.
Very fluid, very fast. It's so important, though, just to note that consent is everything.
Right, because they're not going to tap into the limbic system if they don't feel safe. Okay, so the tapping thing, I've heard about tapping, and I've listened to, like it mentioned in a couple podcasts, and people even talking about how they've seen other people, like, out in public, like in an airport or something, like doing their own, like, tapping. So why does that, I guess, like, how does that access or further someone's ability to access their limbic system, like that touch versus the eye movement?
I mean, that's a great question. I think I would want to see that, because I remember back in the day, prior, I'd say, because before I found this path of being a therapist, I had mentioned earlier before we'd met here that my goal was to go into medicine. I loved medicine, pre-medicine. And I remember being very obsessed with nutrition and the body, because I'm like, whoa, how does cortisol and everything work? But anyways, the long and the short was I remember meeting someone funny at a vitamin shop, and not endorsing, but just giving background, that she was doing something on tapping. I think it's like, really, you're legitimately just going around tapping.
Right.
So, see, when you first said that, my memory went back to, where did that seem from? Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Where might I have seen that? There it is. So, perfect example of how our memories inform us, right? But the point being is that if that's that kind of tapping, I don't know. I mean, there's no harm in saying I don't know. So, I'm going to be very honest with you, right? I don't know how that tapping works. I remember just kind of meeting her. I was like, oh, this is pretty cool. Not my cup of tea. I'm going to get my vitamins and get out. But, I mean, moving forwards, I personally, I recently experienced a loss, and I remember a part of me being able to do that, I have to take care of myself. So I actually reached out to the consultant who helped me through the certification, and we reprocessed a really painful event that had happened. And even she had actually recommended at some point, I'm always continuously learning, she had said to, if you're still feeling it, because you're going to feel very sad, it was a loss, it was a death. And she's like, if you're feeling it, just tap your feet. Tap your hands. Just tap your feet. That actually can still allow you to process through whatever is still residual. So in that capacity, I understand that you're still tapping, because you're allowing, as you're feeling and experiencing a flashback, or you're feeling something that's very sad and connected to that memory, being able to tap your feet or tap your hands, and you're just closing your eyes and you're just, okay. I love that it doesn't allow you to draw negative attention. It's kind of like you're tapping along to a song.
Right.
So you can do it out in public, not feel ashamed, but you have a way to also allow yourself to still process through. Because EMDR, it's so much fun, because let's say someone comes in and we process something and they never want to come back in again. It could happen. So with that in mind, I'm okay, because once you set the train off the track, it keeps going. On the track, not off the track. Oops, that could be a trauma. Yeah. Right, it's like,
that sounds terrifying.
Yes. So all we're doing is we're putting the train on the track. We're giving it the fuel, the steam, to say, okay, we're going to get it going, push it down. Like a grasshopper, something in motion stays in motion. It's moving forward.
Well, and kind of like going back to, that we can heal ourselves. So it's just almost like that recognizing, okay, like there's a wound here that you've been ignoring, but like, here it is.
Yes.
Even if you never come back for another session,
Correct.
then that's when we maybe do the work on our own, whether we're aware of it or not. Like, can it happen on that level of like, just like a subconscious level of starting to kind of work through and process our stuff without actively trying to do it?
You'll start to have more insight, awareness, dreams, because things that have been, using a Freudian word here, but it's been suppressed, you're just keeping it in. Your body is like, okay, we let it go. We started to let it unravel. I guess now I'm just going to give it a place to continue that it can keep traveling, just keep going. So that might show up in different ways. I mean, it's fun. I like to do little experiments with clients with permission, of course, where I say, here, you know what? If we can't do consistency, because consistency, it's key, you want to keep doing it consistently until you're really getting down to 0 twice and you're completing your memories. But oftentimes when not, I say, here, let's try 2 weeks, because if you can't come in, it's fine. See what works, what doesn't work, and it's incredible the feedback I get, because even, let's say, when they're not in here for 2 weeks, things happen, life, travel, work, family, the feedback of what they're noticing, it's so significant. I really, obviously with HIPAA I can't, but it'd be so cool if they could share their stories, because it's such a unique experience that no one, I say this concretely, no one will have the same exact experience.
Right.
So when someone comes in and they're telling me all this different awareness and insight, it's like, am I talking to the same person? Like, this is so cool, because they start to feel things differently. They start to shift, and they see it. And I'm talking about people who have come in who are very, very, I've had some of the worst cases of anxiety in this last year of people coming in. And for them we've reprocessed, we've started the train. They take a bit of time because of scheduling conflict for them, right? But they come back in, I'm like, oh my, I wish I could record. It was just so awesome.
Yeah.
Because things are moving. That's the whole point. Things are moving.
Things are moving and things are healing.
Yes.
Okay, so just to like almost shift gears a little bit, but not so much. So like mindfulness and meditation, like those are big words right now, and kind of paying attention to how we feel and everything. And so you just kind of mentioned that awareness and like insight into yourself, which is often talked about as one of the benefits of like mindfulness and meditation. It can be a byproduct of awareness, I guess, of these root issues.
Correct.
So talk a little bit about why mindfulness is so important, and then also like without doing something like EMDR and kind of having the awareness of those earlier memories or those triggers or those root issues, just by starting to practice mindfulness techniques, will we get there on our own?
That's a hard one to answer, only because, we're so uncertain of that. I think in many ways, yes, once someone's, if someone comes in here or just in general, let's say someone's going around, they're seeing a therapist, and they start to have awareness of something. Wait a second, I'm going into therapy because I'm having panic attacks, but this person kind of helped me figure out and recognize that, well, this might actually be related to, like I lost someone when I was, what? This could be all connected to it, of that awareness. The fact, again, that therapist has helped facilitate the connection between the mind and the body. That is already a vehicle to healing. Because again, there's a saying, it's like name it to tame it. So if you can start recognizing, whoa, this is where it's coming from. There are definitely many facets within mental health, therapy, mindfulness hacks, tricks, etc., yoga, all these different techniques that can still allow you to feel like you're self-soothing, but it may not necessarily feel like you're targeting the issue, if that makes sense. You've learned to live with it and say, okay, well, kind of what I have now. Imagine it's like our appendix. It's like, well, I guess I've learned that it doesn't really do much for me now. Maybe process some stuff here and there, but we just learn to live with it. Yeah. And if it comes out, it has to come out.
Yeah. Mine came out. Mine burst.
Oh my gosh. I'm so glad you're here. That's very dangerous. That's scary, right? But I mean, also too, it's like, think about it. We just learn to say, okay, it's here. We deal with it. The same thing of what our heart and our lungs do and everything that our organs do. We're mindful, become more aware, like when we learn in school what its function are, and then we learn to live with it. And then we learn to listen to it. We respond to its pain. Yes. But it doesn't mean we actually can fix it, or we'll probably have to be informed to go say, well, okay, I'm still feeling this kind of come up. Or perhaps we'll say, wow, I used to have a heart murmur when I was a kid, and I remember they put this this chest thing and the heart monitor on me. Wow, maybe there's something wrong with my child. Oh, okay. And then they'll do something about it. But mindfulness, it's a very powerful vehicle into, I guess, resource, meaning offer comfort as a tool in your toolbox, but also allow you to feel more connected to self. Nowadays, it's funny, we have our technology, our tools, like we're so disconnected. So there's a term that's been used, I'm sure you've heard this, like being asleep. A lot of people, I've heard it's like we're all asleep if we're sucked into social media and this and that. We become so disconnected from self. How do we learn who we are? Mindfulness challenges that and say, well, guess what? We're still here. You're good. If you're feeling sad or anxious, like someone has like 1 billion likes and you only have like 20 likes, you're good. It doesn't mean that you failed. Any part of you that's hurting, you just send it love, mindfulness. Even the other day, I always listen to music when I need to get out of my own head, right? So when I'm like, okay, I'm listening to some music, I'll change it up. And I don't know about you, but for me, when I'm at concerts, I love bass lines. I don't know, maybe I was a bassist in the past life, but boom, 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 boom. So when I'm listening, I'm always listening for a bass line. And I'm noticing how it feels within my heart, noticing what color it would be, if it was an energy, where would it be flowing? And even just, again, checking in with myself, but using something external. That's why I said, I don't know about you, we've all done this to some degree. It's how we kind of process information from music. We're taking in the notes. We're trying to understand what the instruments might be. So it's a powerful tool that can help us cope with things. Also heal. But also allow us to know that we're still safe.
Right.
Yeah. No, a tangent about that, but...
So, no, I like that. So is the kind of the ultimate goal to... Because I've kind of always viewed it as trying to get to those, like, root experiences or traumas so that you can, like, reframe them or undo them or heal them. But then now I'm wondering, is it really more just all about just being aware that they're there and like almost accepting them? Like what is kind of the end goal result of identifying those like initial trauma events?
We understand through where its root is, where its source is. So in other words, if we're able to understand where the fire or the bleed is coming from, we have options and tools to help heal that. Whether it be we have to manually go in, repair it through sutures, aka coming in for therapy, medication, whatever that might be, or perhaps it just needs a Band-Aid or a tourniquet. Stop the hemorrhaging. We're just given that opportunity to see, okay, well, wow, this is where this is coming from. And this is what's so beautiful about free choice, self-efficacy, advocacy, you're still your own person as the expert of you. It's up to you to decide. EMDR is not a one-size-fits-all. Absolutely not. I mean, everyone comes in and is like, oh, well, are you going to do EMDR? I mean, I don't do it on everyone. Matter of fact, no. I feel like that would be pretty boring if you ask my personal opinion. I mean, there's so much variety in life, and, to say this is a one size, here, I'm going to do this you and you and you, I feel like it would become mechanical in many ways. And part of the joy that I have in this experience as a therapist is I learn so much from people when they come in here, as much as I hope that they can learn something from me. And to be able to honor that through different techniques like cognitive behavioral therapy. So I sometimes flip it on its head and say, okay, well, event happens, we have a feeling, and then our thoughts dictate how we respond. But I still stay true to the form. Something happens, we have a thought, feeling, and then we direct our behavior towards that. Whatever melts someone's butter. Mindfulness regardless, even if it's a skill that's more or less dialectal behavior in theory, like there's one where Miss Linehan, who founded DBT, I think it's at the tip. It's like you're just tipping the scales on your body temperature. So, for example, if someone is, having a moment where they feel like they're spiraling, shock your system by putting something that's freezing on the back of your neck, inside your wrist, or just like when we wash our face, that cold water is like, oh, okay, I'll stop. Or like
it's like a reset.
Yeah, someone like throws cold water and they're like, oh.
Yeah.
Yeah. So even though like different techniques can be useful. So EMDR doesn't have to be saying, because there's a lot of people that come in too, and if it doesn't work, it always works. It can work when it's done right.
Yeah.
It always, because you can't fail at EMDR.
Right.
The clinician can fail the client though by not keeping them safe. And what that means is that if they're not adequately prepared to understand what that would feel like, where resourcing mindfulness can be helpful, that somatic mind connection, mind-body connection, they can feel like, well, I'm not activated, it's just not for me, I'm broken. oh. And I've had people come in, and that hurts my heart to hear, because I'm like, wow, like, you're not broken. You're not broken. It can work. Unfortunately, we're all on this earth to learn. And to be fair, that person probably was okay, but maybe perhaps they just weren't at a point where they understood what you needed for safety. And that's okay. But let's try to work forward from that, because you can heal. You're trying to. The fact that you've come in here and you want to give it another shot, you've considered it, or even don't want to consider it. We're talking about it. They mentioned it for a reason. Let's entertain that for a second. But yes, even closure, because going into the fourth part and fifth part, that's when we do the eye movements, reprocessing. Fifth is the fifth stage, is an installation where we take a memory. We want to get it down to 0. I will consistently ask in between, what are you noticing now? What are you noticing now? It's okay. So when you go back to the original memory on a scale from 0 to 10, where would you rate it? Until it's 0 twice, because it's ecologically sound. Then we go installation, where, when you look back, when you think of this moment, and you feel yourself in this moment, what would you prefer to believe about yourself instead? And we install the positive belief. And then I ask them, how true does that feel on a scale of 1 to 7? And we want to do 7 twice. The last thing is we do a body scan, which is also very mindful. And at the end, closure. And that's the story of EMDR. But you see, mindfulness in that sense, finding the root, you're still able to learn something about your awareness. That's the key to anything. So I tell my kids that come here, I see a lot of kids too, and I say, right now, yes, you're sitting here as a 12, 13-year-old, that's fine, but even let's say they're doing fairly well, so let's say you don't come in here ever again. I want you to take this away from our time together, that no matter what someone tells you throughout the rest of your life, you are always going to be the expert of you.
I love that so much. And I only recently heard that concept a couple weeks ago, and I had never thought of that, but because it's almost a hard concept to believe, because we carry so much almost like awareness of what we don't know, and guilt and shame regarding mistakes, but to kind of try and view yourself as the expert of you versus other people know better that's just a huge and difficult mental shift.
Yes. And when I say it's like with kids, when they hear that, they're like, really? I'm like, yes. No matter what someone tells you, even in my capacity, if I'm telling you something that doesn't feel right, doesn't sit right, doesn't sound right, that's okay. I am not here to tell you who you are. I'm not here to change who you are. You are here, and we're just planting seeds. We're just allowing you to be. Because, when kids come in, they tell me some behaviors that are what we as adults would be like, oh, okay, that's kind of concerning, like manipulation, lying. I'm saying, how is that helpful for you? Because clearly it's helping.
Right.
And
there's a reason.
Yeah, they're like, wait, what?
Yeah.
It's okay to say that in here? And I'm like, of course. It's obviously helping. I'm like, but how does it, I want to understand. I'm like, it's okay. I'm not here to, to tell mom, dad what you're trying to explain. I'm just trying to understand you as I'm listening to learn from you.
Right.
And it's so cool.
Well, and I love that, because we do that even as adults, and we label it like self-destructive behavior. But so instead to view it as what is the quote unquote good we're getting out of it? Like, why do we need to do that? Like, what need are we fulfilling with that? Like, that's just a really interesting perspective. Okay. I want to end with a question on what advice would you give somebody that maybe recognizes they've got stuff they haven't processed, as I'm sure we all do, but there's at least some level of awareness there, but they are hesitant to go into any kind of therapy, either because it's maybe lives in kind of a pride camp of I can figure it out on my own, or a fear camp of I know the work will be difficult and uncomfortable and I don't want to do that. And as I say this out loud, I'm probably describing myself. What advice would you give them, of just a couple, just 1 or 2 initial first steps they can take down that healing path, even if it doesn't look like walking into a therapist's office?
First thing, do the solid of looking up what we call the trans-theoretical model of change, or the process of change, because there's several steps within our mechanism of how we change or come to decide that we want to address a behavior or change a behavior. And we do this organically in most things that we experience in life. And so if you're ambivalent, hesitant, that's perfectly normal. That, as a matter of fact, that trans-theoretical model of change would validate that.
Right, because it's just part of the like steps towards being ready to actually take action, and it's a necessary step. Okay. Oh, I love that.
Yes, and that's why I asked like one or two. I would just be like, I would love to validate what you're feeling, the good, the bad, the uncertain. That's okay. I always start where someone's at. It doesn't matter what someone has going on out there. The moment they come in here, I shut my door with them. I start where that person's at always. It's never my agenda. That's why I have all my tools on deck, but in general, they're the only agenda these individuals should live by is their own. So if they're not there yet, that's okay. And when they do feel like they're ready, my hope, although it may take about 5 or 6, which is the standard for when someone would probably find the best fit for them, is that when they do find their person, a therapist, mental health professional, maybe it's a life coach, whatever's going to meld their better, it would be a place where they truly can feel heard. And I'd wish them the best for finding their healing. Yeah,
I love that, because that ties back to kind of one of just my biggest themes of recognizing we are all in process. And so then also that key point of like accepting where you are in that process.
Correct.
Instead of thinking or wishing or judging that you were further ahead, but you are where you are, and that's okay. And as is everybody else.
Right. We're just doing the best we can.
Yes, I love that. Okay, tell everybody where they can find you, including like Instagram, because I love your Instagram handle.
Oh, that's fun. I mean, my Instagram is Coastal Beaches Therapy. It's my business name, Coastal Beaches Therapy, my practice name. I love it because it also means cognitive behavioral therapy. If you take out the words and put the initials out there, it's I like to have fun with what I do. I can also be found online, coastalbeachestherapy.com. Psychology Day would be Amy Pope-Latham, LCSW. I can also be found, I guess, geographically in Florida, in Jacksonville, but my office is located in Ponte Vedra Beach, right on the road of A1A. And if you have any questions ever, regardless of where you are in the world, you are more than welcome to reach out. I would not be able to provide any type of clinical advice, judgment. As a matter of fact, therapists, we don't give advice, but it doesn't matter right now. Point being is that if you have any questions ever, you are not alone. And my hope is that if you do need someone to reach out to, you feel like you have one more person that you could reach out to if you needed it. So I'm here if you need or just want to say hi or give me a couple of likes on my Instagram stories. Just kidding. You don't have to. But be cool if you did. But cool. So, yes.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Casey. This is so much fun.
Yes.
All right, that'll do it for this week. Thank you so much for listening. Make sure you are subscribed so you don't miss next week where we re-air our #1 most downloaded episode of the podcast so far. And then we will close out the year with a solo episode and then jump into 2021 where we will hear from all kinds of amazing guests. If you've been enjoying the show, please take a moment to leave it a rating and a review on whatever podcast platform you listen to it on. That helps a lot and it means the world to me. And make sure you are following us on the socials. We are on Facebook and Instagram at The Better You Podcast. And that is it. Thank you again. Hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day and a fabulous week.